Our story begins in 14th century Europe. The Crusades have ebbed and flowed for over 2 centuries, with little outward signs of progress, but within Europe itself, the effect of the Pope's ability to muster support for a multinational crusade against the infidel served to heighten the influence and temporal authority of the Church as never before. The endless lust of princes and kings for territory and glory was channeled into the parallel quest of the Church to gain control of the Holy Land. Offering them indulgences and absolution from all sin, along with rights and privileges over exotic and fabulously wealthy Oriental trading routes, proved an irresistible magnet for nobles to act on their territorial ambitions and conquer the Levant on behalf of the Church, in a symbiotic relationship that would eventually fracture the whole continent. It is one of the strange ironies of history that despite its ongoing and ultimate failure to gain the Holy Land, the Crusades actually had the effect of strengthening the Church's grip on power. The royal houses of Europe, exhausted and largely bankrupted from fruitless campaigning in the East, were heavily in debt. Their failure to succeed in their mission of Christian conquest was increasingly blamed on their moral failings by a clergy that successfully used tactics of superstitious guilt, coercion, and ultimately threat of excommunication to achieve its ends. By politically submitting themselves to the moral authority of the Church in order to justify their expansionist greed, the nobility now found itself under their constant scrutiny, interference, and manipulation. The power of the Church now transcended all national and feudal boundaries, pushing itself to the height of its power and influence. All throughout Christendom, vast building projects were underway as cathedral spires grew ever taller and more elaborate, projecting the power and influence of the clergy over both kings and commoners alike. The Church became arbiter in almost all disputes, with few princes having the temerity to challenge the decisions and edicts pronounced by a pope, who, with the stroke of a pen, could excommunicate even an emperor, abolishing their divine right to rule, placing entire kingdoms at the mercy of neighbouring rulers who would be called into local crusades against them. Of course, in time, the aristocracy found ways of subverting the Church as well, backing their own candidates for the papal mitre, with rival popes and anti-popes jockeying for control of the souls and estates of Europe, plunging at times the entire continent into chaos. Fortunately for the elites, the climate in Europe had been the warmest and mildest in a millennium, thanks to solar flare activity, reduced volcanism, and changing ocean currents that brought about what is now known as the medieval warm period, from about 900 to 1300 AD. During this time, crop yields increased significantly, about 7 to 1, which means 7 seeds produced for every 1 planted, producing surpluses that saw the human and livestock population explode to levels never before seen. All of these resources could of course be taxed by the ruling elites, who continued to indulge their lifestyle of excess on the back of booming agriculture and trade. However, by the end of the 1200s, all of this was about to change. Over the course of a decade or two, the climate suddenly began to cool, and summers became cooler with the heaviest ongoing rain in living memory. Winters became colder, harsher, and longer, in what would later become known as the Little Ice Age. These sudden climactic changes led to a repeated failure of fruiting and crop ripening, as well as curing of animal fodder, such that stock numbers fell by upwards of 80% in some places, and the wheat crop yield fell to as low as 2 seeds produced for every 1 planted, or in other words, 1 seed produced for food and 1 for planting next year. In comparison, today's crop yields are around 30 to 1. The result was skyrocketing food prices, pilfering of future grain stores, and a dwindling of both livestock and draft animals that led to the catastrophic Great Famine of 1315, which saw up to 25% of the population of Europe perish from starvation, while accounts of dramatically increased violence, civil collapse, and even cannibalism abounded. This wanton descent to violence led to the collapse of the traditional code of chivalry, which had heretofore seen few nobles ever killed in combat. But now there was a return to viciousness and murder on a scale not seen since the collapse of the Roman Empire. With little respite, the famine dragged on for decades. Wars and invasions increased, partly out of desperation, adding to the chaos of misery and despair among the peasants, who comprised 95% of the population and were already living below the poverty line, many of whom were indentured and in serfdom, with no right to relocate or seek other employment. Foraging for food in the king's forests or a bishop's estates was punishable by death, so peasants were frequently dying of starvation, while deer, boar and rabbits roamed free and unmolested. All the while, new taxes were being dreamed up and imposed on the populace to finance offshore wars and political intrigue. In many places, the church owned more property than the monarch and levied taxes of their own on destitute serfs, often substantially more hefty than other landlords. As money for fortresses and cathedrals began to dry up, strange and creative practices were being approved by bishops to raise funds for continued building and to encourage the pilgrim tourist trade. From the selling of indulgences in a cash for forgiveness service to a trade in relics and miracles that would look entirely at home in a Monty Python sketch or a Disney theme park, ordinary people living in abject poverty were being fleeced, while they watched their spiritual leaders continue to live a life of high debauchery and excess that seemed entirely at odds with the sermons they were preaching every Sunday. Factions within the clergy also vied with one another for territorial expansion and influence, as competing monastic orders became micro-regimes in their own right, operating outside the jurisdiction of the crown and answerable only to the Pope, issuing laws and taxes of their own upon an increasingly emaciated population. Gradually, murmurings began to surface against the lifestyle of the bishops, not just from the commoners, but also from poor parish priests who spent their days ministering to the growing number of sick and infirm, as well as burying increasing numbers of malnourished children. Universities, which were the centres of philosophy, discourse and debate, became both an incubator of dissenting thought as well as the soapbox from which critical tracts were published, calling for reform. Universities were often bankrolled by the nobility, who secretly and sometimes openly supported dissident professors in voicing their criticisms, being only too happy to back intellectuals who accused the church of abuses and calling for its reform. These usually entailed criticism of the church as a dynastic and temporal power without justification in the Bible. Its ownership of property, the selling of indulgences, simony or cash for jobs, and the existence of independent monastic orders that, in the words of English proto-reformer John Wycliffe, were nothing more than cults. Theologians like Wycliffe that enjoyed the patronage of nobles such as John of Gaunt and his nephew the King of England were agitators, chipping away at the periphery of church power while arguing for a return of ultimate control to the crown. They often walked a fine line, lobbying in support of their king, but often risking their ire and abandonment if their publications were viewed as heretical or potentially treasonous. If they could be used to manipulate a treaty or avoid the payment of papal taxes, then they received all the oxygen a royal court could give them. But if they became an excommunication risk, they were quickly handed over to church authorities who dealt with them in the usual manner, burning both their books and the authors at the stake. Nobody expected reformers to have much of an impact upon the broader fabric of society that still remained in the iron grip of church and state. Until 1346, when the Black Death crossed into Europe. Now, an emaciated, weak and vulnerable population, having barely survived decades of famine, war and starvation, found itself struck by a horrific plague that spread swiftly and silently throughout the entire continent, wiping out entire towns and cities in a painful, indiscriminate and grotesque pandemic that was literally of biblical proportions. Upwards of half the population of Europe perished within a couple of years. Ordinary people, already viewing the ongoing famine as some kind of divine punishment, now began to wonder if the prophesied end of the world was unfolding. Many assumed a correlation between the state of their world and the Church, which had been politically fragmented since the kidnapping by King Philip IV of France of Pope Boniface VIII in 1303. Itinerant preachers, encouraged by Wycliffe and his Lollard followers to travel the countryside and preach the gospel to illiterate peasants in their native language, were viewed as heroes among the people, but as enemies of a church that was now being put under increasing pressure from all sides for reform, in a medieval glasnost that ended up having the same kind of ultimate consequences. Professors became increasingly bold and condemning, using the church's own tactics of superstition against them, calling it first only for its reform and later for its abolition altogether. The church was having headaches of its own after repeatedly failing to lobby the French to have the Pope's court returned to Rome, appointing, with the support of the Holy Roman Emperor, a rival anti-pope to disqualify him and rule from Rome once again. The result was a political, theological, and philosophical schism that had direct consequences on European politics and led to religious turmoil for centuries to come. It was at the tail end of this first wave of the Black Death and emerging papal rivalry that our protagonist, Jan Hus, was born, in a small provincial village called Husinec in what is today the Czech Republic, or Czechia, in about 1372. Not much is known about his early life, except that his family were peasants and that his father had probably died during his infancy. At around the age of 10, he was sent, possibly to escape poverty, to a monastery where he quickly learned to read and write and impressed his masters sufficiently that they recommended him to further study in Prague, one of the largest cities in Bohemia and among the most intellectually active in Europe, to which he was sent when he turned 18. He settled into university life, earning his bachelor's degree by 1394, and then his master's degree in 1396, taking up a teaching position on Greek philosophy as well as the emerging theological philosophy of John Wycliffe in England. This probably motivated his interest in studying theology more profoundly, earning him a bachelor's degree in divinity in 1404, from which he continued to pursue a doctorate. He was an academic in every sense of the word. An anecdote about his awakening religiosity that would later prove prophetic occurred while sitting around a fire with friends and reading about the martyrdom of St. Lawrence, when he suddenly thrust his arm into the flames, whereupon his friends jumped to pull him away. When questioned about why he would do such a thing, Hus replied that he was merely trying to see how much of that holy man's torture he would himself be capable of enduring. And so began the religious awakening of a young man whose intense study, sincere devotion, and immovable fortitude would inspire a nation and send shockwaves through the Christian world and influence the future of Europe forever. Unlike other religious reformers of his age, Jan Hus never spoke of a cathartic experience or a dramatic calling to faith. Indeed, he once wrote that his early ambition to join the priesthood was to secure a good livelihood, to dress well and be esteemed by men. But as his relaxed varsity lifestyle gave way to a deeper and more mature study, he came under the influence of older, more fundamentalist teachers who inspired him in both a simpler and more solid faith, as well as arousing a more pronounced Czech national consciousness at a time when Germans dominated both the universities and the royal court. He became immersed in writing and fierce theological debate that endeared him to students and made him a champion of the faculty, a number of the professors being themselves both Wycliffe supporters and Czech nationalists. Hus once remarked of his transition to seriousness that, "When the Lord gave me knowledge of the Scriptures, I discarded from my foolish mind all that kind of stupid fun-making." He was soon promoted to Dean of Philosophy and by 1402 became a rector of the university. As a fully qualified priest in 1402, he was now appointed to preach at the Bethlehem Chapel, whose masters already courted scandal by preaching in the native Czech language rather than Latin. Hus now began giving his own fiery sermons, denouncing the moral corruption of society and the elites who perpetuated it, not even sparing the papacy from criticism, drawing packed crowds that ranged in composition from peasants to princes, and that came to hear his vision of a simplified religious life, influenced largely by Wycliffe. He was fortunate at the time to have the modest backing of the young and progressive Archbishop of Prague, Zaitz, who turned a deaf ear to some of the more controversial aspects of Hus's sermons. While all this was going on, remember that there were two popes, Innocent VII in Rome, who died and was succeeded by Gregory XII in 1406, and Benedict XIII in Avignon. Each had excommunicated the other and claimed divine and temporal supremacy over the Church, in what was essentially a political, not theological rivalry, as had been the case in past inter-Christian conflicts. Both the nobility and the clergy found themselves conflicted about their loyalties, as well as the legitimacy of religious rites such as marriages, baptisms and burials, fearing that if their candidate lost out, all of the sacraments and rites conducted across their kingdoms thus far would be null and void, making them very nervous indeed. The reason there were two popes essentially comes down to debt. The French king Philip IV, having long been at war with the English and simultaneously dealing with disastrous rebellions in Flanders, not to mention the consequences of the extreme famine already mentioned, was bankrupt, and made matters worse by devaluating the currency to bolster his treasury. This led to catastrophic inflation and an economic collapse. Scrounging for whatever cash he could, and to avoid having to pay back his loans, he contrived to get rid of his two major creditors, Jewish as well as Knights Templar bankers. So he had both the Jews and Templars of France rounded up, expelling the former and having the Templars declared heretics and burned at the stake. He then confiscated all their property, but continued collecting on the debts owed to them by assigning his own agents to collect and pass the ill-gotten income into the royal treasury instead. Buoyed by his success, Philip now levied a tax upon the French clergy as well, expecting them to hand over half their income to the crown, which caused the Pope in Rome to finally act against him and issue proclamations against France. Feigning an attempt at compromise, Philip invited the Pope, Boniface VIII, to negotiations. These soon broke down. The Pope had Philip excommunicated, so in retaliation, the king's troops attacked the Pope at his residence, beating him severely and causing him to die soon after. So powerful was his influence that Philip pressured the conclave of cardinals to install a Frenchman as pontiff. Then, citing security issues, had the new Pope Clement V move his permanent residence to Avignon in France, where Philip could keep a firm grip on church affairs. The next 7 successive popes were, to no one's surprise, all Frenchmen, and Avignon remained the centre of papal affairs for the next 67 years in what historians have come to call the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. Finally, in 1377, the court moved back to Rome. The Pope mysteriously died soon after, and the cardinals moved heaven and earth to put an Italian back on the throne. But their only candidate, Urban VI, turned out to be a totally unexpected package for a Neapolitan. He was a hardline, anti-corruption fundamentalist reformer, and he hit the ground running, putting a serious stop to their lavish gravy train by banning a number of unethical income streams and corrupt practices. The cardinals regretted their decision almost as soon as they let him loose, and hightailed it back to the embrace of the French king, declaring the recent papal election invalid on bogus technicalities, and proceeded to hold a new one, installing, you guessed it, another Frenchman, Clement VII, who, unsurprisingly, excommunicated his opponent in Rome and declared him an anti-pope, antichrist, and anti-anything else you could think of to win support for their new guy back in Avignon. As I mentioned previously, this put all the princes of Europe in a conundrum. With all this excommunicating and warring of one pope against another, picking the loser could nullify your alliances, cost you your kingdom, and apparently also your soul. With all the suffering through famine, pestilence and war that ordinary people had gone through, for some it seemed like this latest church outrage was the harbinger of the end of the world, while for others it was just another example that illustrated beyond doubt the corruption and untrustworthiness of the papacy. Some called for its reform, while others began to call for its abolishment. The King of Bohemia, Wenceslas IV, had inherited a downsized kingdom from his esteemed father, who had, upon his death, also distributed significant holdings to other relatives, as well as Wenceslas' half-brother Sigismund, who was currently King of Hungary, and ever keen on adding Wenceslas' territories in Bohemia and Germany to his own portfolio. Lacking both the resources or temperament to rule effectively, Wenceslas was deposed and disempowered by his own barons as well as city leagues a number of times, finally clawing his way back to some modest semblance of authority, despite the duplicitous scheming of Sigismund in the background. Like most kings, Wenceslas gravitated towards the Pope that would most likely support him in a crisis, but publicly he ordered both his universities and his bishops to remain neutral. But cracks eventually began to appear as Archbishop Zeitz remained firmly loyal to the Pope in Rome, and within the universities, the only group to clearly enunciate their neutrality were the Czechs, largely represented by Hus and his followers. The Germans, who had long dominated the cultural landscape of Bohemia, resented Wenceslas' dithering and grew increasingly hostile towards him. Because of his stance for the king and critical of the papacy, Hus' relationship with the archbishop now began to sour, but this was balanced by the increasing admiration he received from Wenceslas and other nobles. Czech loyalty now began to pay off, as Germans left Prague in protest, leaving the Czechs largely in control of Bohemian civil institutions. Thanks to the cordial relations arising out of Wenceslas' sister marrying the King of England, Hus and his students got their hands on suppressed treatises by Wycliffe, fresh out of Oxford, and not only translated them, but read them aloud from the pulpit. These later treatises, as you might expect, became ever more critical of the papacy, but more importantly, questioned some of the very foundational tenets of the Church, such as impanation, or the belief that the bread of the Eucharist literally becomes the body of Christ. Merely broaching the subject for discussion was declared a heresy punishable by death, and yet Hus and Wycliffe openly and publicly supported debate over a number of other such accepted tenets that nevertheless were unclear or contentious within the text of the Bible. Soon enough, the Pope in Rome, still assuming authority, got wind of all this Bohemian rebelliousness, not to mention King Wenceslas' tolerance of it, which marked him out as a probable heretic as well. So, in 1408, the Pope in Rome, Gregory XII, sent a warning to the king, who realised he was now in a precarious situation, and ordered the surrender of all banned books from the university, so that the archbishop could correct them. Hus, perhaps naively, relishing the possibility of dissecting those corrections once they were complete, complied with the order, sparing himself and the king further molestation for the time being. While there are scores of disputed points of dogma that were debated back and forth and could lead to charges of heresy, it might be worth considering a few of the more substantial bones of contention that dissenting intellectuals such as Wycliffe, Hus, and others had with the established positions of the Church. One such contention was that they felt that the Church had no business owning property, meddling in politics, or being directly involved in warfare, which should best be left to anointed kings. They also felt that each state should be free to manage its own Christian affairs, headed ultimately by their monarch, who would be the protector of the faith. They also believed that people had a right to read the Bible and hear sermons in their own language. Similarly, they felt that the Bible itself was the highest source of authority and not the Pope or a bishop when deciding upon a point of contention. They claimed that many church practices, and in particular the sacrament of the Eucharist, its meaning and assumption of transubstantiation, which was only recently adopted by the Church within the last 100 years, were entirely debatable and, for the most part, unnecessary. And perhaps most importantly, a lot of these dissidents felt that the selling of indulgences, church positions, and favours for financial gain was immoral and should be immediately banned. Basically, dissenters wanted the church to wield less power and hand it back to the kings, which explains why many of them found benefactors and quiet support in the royal houses of Europe. They also wanted freedom of conscience, based upon their own interpretation of the scriptures, rather than submit to the corrupt rulings of an out-of-control institutional monolith. While Wenceslas was busy shoring up support back home and dodging the scrutiny of popes 1 and 2, cardinals all over Europe, exasperated, continued in their attempts to resolve the papal deadlock, calling a number of joint councils, but each ending in a stalemate, and the refusal of either pope and their respective successors to back down. Eventually, frustrated cardinals convened yet another council in Pisa in 1409, this time resolving to depose both popes under various joint charges of scandal and abuse of power, and thereby, declaring the Holy See vacant, elect a fresh one, which they duly concluded by announcing a new unifying pope called Alexander V. A number of nobles supported this move, including Wenceslas, hoping to usher in a new age and fresh opportunities for himself, and he was supported in this by Hus and the Czech elites, publicly pressuring Archbishop Zeitz to do the same. However, the refusal of the existing two popes to stand down meant that most of the European powers were still too nervous to commit themselves fully to the new one, which only had the effect of now increasing the number of competing pontiffs to 3, each condemning the others as devil-worshipping anti-popes in a spaghetti western kind of standoff that was making a mockery of the entire church and slowly turning public opinion against all of them. Remember that Europe was, by 1409, just barely emerging from a horrific century of unimaginable famine and pestilence, which many people were now publicly interpreting as divine retribution for the corruption within the church. Peasants were getting uppity, as the manpower to work farms and estates had plunged to critical levels, leaving the nobility under pressure to increase wages, conditions, and benefits for existing workers, or risk their absconding to greener pastures. The bubonic plague death count had the supply and demand effect of boosting the value of surviving workers, with employers struggling to suppress their empowerment and pressuring governments instead to pass laws limiting upward mobility. But once the genie was out of the bottle, there was no going back, as the increasing cynicism of the peasantry made them more prone to rebellion all across Europe. Back in Prague, Archbishop Zeitz, concerned at the threat to church power that the growing anti-clerical and anti-conformist sentiment presented, now tried to curry favour with Pope No. 3, appealing to Alexander for resources and support to more aggressively eradicate the movement. The new pope, obviously keen to project what shaky ecclesiastical power he had, happily responded and issued a number of proclamations, or bulls, denouncing the Englishman Wycliffe as a heretic and banning any unauthorised preaching or discussion of his material, but now went one step further, and in 1410 declared all promoters of unorthodox ideas as heretics to be excommunicated. So it was that Hus and a number of other leaders were excommunicated. Hus appealed, citing the Bible directly as his defence and challenging anyone to show where in the texts he was in error, but the Pope, gripping onto his tenuous position, would have none of it. Fortunately for Hus, his chief benefactor was King Wenceslaus, and especially his wife, Queen Sophia, along with a substantial number of Bohemian nobles who regularly sat in on Hus's sermons in the Czech language at the renegade Bethlehem Chapel. Seeing Hus as a patriot as well as a holy man, they largely ignored the edicts against him, and Hus continued to both preach and write. Meanwhile, Archbishop Zayt's book-burning frenzy infuriated the public as well as the students of the university, not to mention the king, who retaliated by confiscating church property and withholding his income. So, fearful for his life, he fled the city and died in exile a year later. Pope number 3 didn't last long either. Declaring his intention to rein in fiscal abuse, he died suddenly less than a year into his reign, some say having been poisoned by his successor, John the 23rd, a wily, ambitious yet pragmatic man who, not even being a priest, was hurriedly ordained a day before being named a bishop and candidate for the top job. Now, the new Pope number 3, like Pope number 2, was a Neapolitan and had enjoyed a successful career up to that point as a gifted military commander serving the papal state. He held a long-standing blood feud against the current King of Naples, Ladislaus, who had executed his 2 brothers some years before and was itching for revenge. Ladislaus, King of Naples by virtue of his birth into the House of Anjou, also had a legitimate claim to the crowns of both Hungary and Croatia, which were currently held by Sigismund, the brother of Wenceslaus, and which he tried on a number of occasions to wrangle from him with the support of disgruntled Hungarian and Croatian nobles, eventually gaining a foothold in Dalmatia, but progressing little further. This squarely made him an enemy of Sigismund, who was looking for allies to eliminate his rival. As protector of the Roman Pope during the Papal Schism, and now having to deal with a 3rd Pope with extreme grudges against him on the northern boundaries of Italy, Ladislaus of Naples mobilised troops to push north to invade Tuscany and conquer the republics of Florence and Siena on his way north to hit Sigismund from 2 directions. Alexander had him excommunicated for moving against him, and after he died, the new Pope III, John the 23rd, took advantage of Ladislaus' excommunication to call a crusade against him. But there were few takers, so he now made the fateful move of authorising the widespread and liberal sale of indulgences to the increasingly cashed-up merchants and peasantry to raise funds for the campaign. Wenceslaus and Sigismund, now facing the threat of invasion by a rival claimant and forced to back their own papal candidate, approved the sale of indulgences in their lands and prepared to make war. This proved to be a fateful decision because Hus, back in the pulpit, had long railed about both the illegitimacy and immorality of selling indulgences as a revenue-raising vehicle for a church that should instead strive to remain poor and stay out of both politics as well as war. Realistically, an indulgence meant that a cashed-up sinner could conveniently buy his way out of hell without having even the slightest remorse, while a poor person who was genuinely remorseful would contrastingly be condemned. Hus viewed this not only as an illogical and un-Christ-like injustice, but also a sign of cruelty. If, as Pope, you have been given the power of heaven to do so, why not forgive everyone for free? The fact that forgiveness was now a commodity available only to the rich through the intercession of a profiteering middleman clergy seemed at odds with Jesus' emphasis on ministering to the poor and disenfranchised. King Wenceslaus, still very much sympathetic to Hus and his teachings and desperate to maintain support among the barons, who largely backed Hus, tried to convene a number of conventions to deliberate and reconcile the church leadership with the dissenters, but the former were hardly free to do so, and the latter made what concessions they could, so far as conscience would allow, which means they basically went around in circles. As Hus and his followers became more numerous, vocal and critical of the cash grab, they drew the additional ire of the Pope in Rome, disgruntled and exiled German theologians, as well as more conservative Czech friends and allies who saw the writing on the wall, some of whom turned against Hus and left Prague to become his greatest persecutors in the days to come. Pope number 3, John the 23rd, not to be outdone, also demanded action from the king and pushed him by declaring an interdict against Prague, which meant that no religious functions, such as weddings, baptisms or funerals, could be performed while Hus was in the city, plunging its citizens into desperation and chaos. Despite protests from the university and not wishing to impose his own fate upon its citizens, Hus left Prague and wandered the country from town to town, sheltered by sympathetic nobles for the next 2 years, as riots flared across the Bohemian countryside. Whilst on his wanderings, he was shocked at how poorly educated local parish priests were. Most barely knew enough Latin to conduct a mass, and less still about theology generally. So he set about writing simple textbooks in Czech that would give them better clarity and inspiration in their calling, as well as allow ordinary peasants to distinguish what was in the Bible and what was merely part of church custom. He wrote letters and tracts in simple layman's language on subjects such as virtuous conduct, kindness and respect for women within marriage, and emphasizing that they had inalienable rights of their own. And he also wrote about the importance of conscience and the need to appeal directly to Christ in all matters. His simple message and plain, direct sermons in their native language electrified and packed parish chapels wherever he went, creating a groundswell of support for a return to grassroots Christian teachings. Ever the intellectual, he also continued to write powerful polemics against his philosophical and theological opponents, many of which would form the foundation of the Protestant Reformation by Luther, Zwingli and Calvin a century later. Eventually, King Sigismund, witnessing a spread of Hussite ideas into Hungary, Poland, Croatia and now west into German territories of his own, and fearing outright civil war in Bohemia that Wenceslas seemed unable or unwilling to control, urged the Council of Cardinals to hold a new conference, depose and punish all 3 popes, and deal decisively with the issues raised by the nonconformists before they caused a bloodbath for the Church. Reluctantly, they agreed, and the conference was scheduled for the spring of 1414 in Sigismund's German city of Constance. As the entire church was now in a deadlock, even the existing 3 popes agreed to participate. Sigismund extended an invitation to Hus with a guarantee of safe passage so that he could participate in the reform process that was hoped would bring peace and stability to the region. Hus accepted the invitation, some say out of naivety and optimism for change, but the fact that he drew up his will before setting out suggests otherwise. He had barely arrived when church officials arrested him and imprisoned him under existing charges of heresy, which made Sigismund lose face, and for which Wenceslas was powerless to intervene. He would have been condemned and executed immediately, but for the continuous flow of appeals, protests and petitions of hundreds of barons to allow him a fair trial and defence of his views. Meanwhile, John the 23rd became fearful of his own fate at the conference and fled, only to be captured, stripped of his papacy and exiled. 1 pope down, 2 to go. This meant that Hus, who was his prisoner, was transferred to the local German bishop's jail cell, from whom he received no mercy whatsoever and remained chained in solitary confinement day and night for the next 73 days, starved and mistreated till he became gravely ill. Eventually, he was given 3 separate hearings, but instead of the anticipated fierce intellectual debate that Hus had thrown his hat in the ring for, nobody challenged him. Instead, the prosecutor simply read out a list of trumped-up charges, demanding he recant, which Hus said he would gladly do, if it could be shown where in the scriptures his teachings were in error. He was also accused of being a Wycliffite, and read out another list of Wycliffe's heretical teachings, which he was demanded to reject. A number of these he did, which was no surprise, as they didn't agree on all points. He nevertheless expressed his admiration for Wycliffe, and wished that he would be fortunate enough to see him in the afterlife. Sigismund, conflicted, admonished Hus to throw himself upon the mercy of the court, not wanting to be seen as having defended a heretic. Hus merely continued to call for debate, questioning the rights of the council over the texts in the Bible. The final hearing had the prosecutors deliver a series of charges drawn from Hus's own writings, which presented him in a dangerous and political light, trying to discourage the support of his patrons, who grew ever more despairing at his refusal to capitulate. Hus again replied that he would be willing to recant any of his statements that could be refuted by the Bible, and once again ridiculed the presumption of any body of men to overrule the authority of the Scriptures. Otherwise, he would not act against his own conscience and would stand by his previous writings. On the 6th of July, 1415, the assembly met once again, and, after Mass, the bishop lectured the delegates as to their duty of eradicating heresy. Hus was dragged in, read his sentence of condemnation, and once again asked to recant. He refused, again demanding real evidence of wrongdoing. He fell on his knees and asked God to forgive his enemies. The next phase of sentencing required him to be dressed in priestly vestments, and once again he was given a chance to recant. Again he refused. He was mocked, cursed, and had his priestly tonsure shaved in an act of humiliation and stripped of all earthly rights. He was bound, a tall heretic's hat was placed on his head, and he was handed over to the executioners, who led him to the stake that had been prepared for his burning. He was now undressed, and being bound to the stake with rope and chains, was asked by the imperial marshal one last time to recant and save his life, which Hus declined, defending his teachings and saying he was ready to die today. It was reported that as the flames engulfed him, instead of screaming, he sang hymns, and that instead of cheering, bystanders sobbed with remorse. His ashes were thrown into the Rhine to prevent any veneration of his remains, but followers nevertheless scooped up soil at the site and returned to their homelands to bury them. The council proceeded to pressure the captured John XXIII to resign, and similarly pressured Gregory XII to do the same. 2 popes down, 1 to go. They now appointed a new, unifying pope. This time it was Otto Colonna, a distinguished cardinal from a respected Roman bloodline, on St. Martin's Day 1417, taking the name Pope Martin V. Benedict XIII in Avignon still had the nominal support of Spain, France and Scotland, but their ability to influence European affairs had substantially declined, and within the next decade, the last of the Avignon popes resigned and recognised Martin as the legitimate pontiff, finally ending the papal schism. Meanwhile, Bohemia, Moravia and other regions adoptive of Hus's teachings were anything but peaceful. Their nobles found a betrayal of guaranteed passage, mock trial and execution of Jan Hus offensive and dishonourable, and vowed to protect other dissident preachers within their territories. They jointly signed a letter of protest condemning the council in the strongest terms and singling out Sigismund for special condemnation for his part in the betrayal of Hus. Sigismund vowed to drown the lot of them and so set the stage for his own confrontation. King Wenceslas now came under the spotlight and found himself unable to dodge either the glare of the church or that of his barons any longer, and in a feeble attempt at saving his own reputation, demanded the disbanding of all rebels and reinstatement of hard-line church officials throughout the country. Both nobles and common folk rose up in rebellion, reinforced by other religious immigrants from all over the Holy Roman Empire, Poland and Lithuania. By 1419, Wenceslas had died of a stroke. Rebels had taken control of Prague and much of the rest of the country, and led by Jan Zelivsky and legendary general Jan Žižka, they stormed the town hall, throwing the officials out of the windows and to their deaths in what came to be known as the defenestration of Prague. Sigismund, who inherited the Bohemian crown from the childless Wenceslas, and now as Holy Roman Emperor, was itching for revenge against the heretic barons who insulted him, called for a crusade against the heretics, who came to be known as the Hussites. Pope Martin assented, but the crusading army was thoroughly thrashed by the Hussites in several pitched battles, and Sigismund was forced to withdraw in shame. In 1422, Sigismund received another dispensation to declare a second crusade, marching in with both German and his own troops, only to be soundly defeated once again by the highly militarized Czech citizen army, along with reinforcements from both Poland and Lithuania. A year later, the Pope called for yet another crusade, but the German army was full of internal discord, and the Danish army decided it just wasn't worth the trouble, so they turned around and went home. Over the span of 15 years, the Hussites, despite internal fragmentation into factions and a wholly democratic system of government, managed to repel 5 consecutive crusades against them, eventually forcing the German nobility and Sigismund at its head to sue for peace, and the Pope to accede to their demands for an autonomous rule and substantial religious independence, which they enjoyed for another century. Hus's writing and inspirational martyrdom spread throughout the continent, and when Martin Luther, 100 years later, finally came around to reading his treatises, he declared that he was himself also a Hussite. Thus, the legacy of Hus, a man of simple faith but powerful intellect and immovable principles, would, through Martin Luther, echo through history and change the face of Europe forever.